Hello, good evening. Welcome to the Awakening Report. I'm on site at Clear Creek Church. This is where the way meets, and with me we have Pastor Don Prisman. Hey Don, it's great to see you.
Hey.
So glad you could come on. Now, as you know, we're going to have the Denver Prophecy Summit is coming up in just 2 weeks, and we are looking at the very exciting topic of Israel and the apocalypse. So we hope that you will join us. If you can join us in person, awesome. We are in Wheat Ridge. You can check us out at denverprophecysummit.com. If you can't make it in person, we encourage you to watch as it's going to be live streamed. It'll be on my YouTube channel, so that's youtube.com/Doug Hamp, and you can see the live streams of the different speakers. It's going to be a lot of fun, and then we're gonna end it with Don's going to give a message on the end times there and back again. So that will be a lot of fun. Now, Don and I have a lot of fun. We like to just kind of sit and chew on the word. It's one of the fun things that we get to do. And we don't always agree on everything, but that's okay. But I don't know any two theologians that actually do.
It would be boring, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable with being called a theologian.
Well, you know, somebody who talks about
just
God.
Just a pastor.
Either way, well, whatever you want to call yourself is fine. But tonight we're going to look at the question of, does information technology prove there's a God? Now, obviously, I think the majority, whoever they are, would say no. There's no proof for God. We evolved, and information technology has nothing to do with DNA. So you've written a paper, I know. It was a very good paper, in fact. So kind of give us your perspective on why you think information technology proves that there's a God.
Well, I'm not sure that information technology proves that there's a God, but information does prove that there is intelligence, and we need to define what we mean when we say information. It's a really interesting word, inform. It means to put a form into something. Now, you have lots of different forms in the universe. All objects have forms, but information is a particular kind of form. It has to do with symbols, and that's what my career was before I became a pastor. I was in information processing, information technology. My degree was in computer science. And computer science is all about processing symbols. Now, the reason that symbols are important relative to God is that the only kind of thing in the universe that generates meaningful symbols are intelligent beings. And so if you find something in nature that has coded symbolic information, then you know that you have an intelligent being that's doing the encoding. Mm-hmm. And that's really what the paper is all about. Because there is a very interesting thing, we'll get to it as we go along, that shows, in fact, there is someone who's very intelligent, and he has encoded some incredibly important information. As a matter of fact, every human being is an example of that. But just to make sure that this idea is clear about encoded symbols, there's a program called the SETI program. Have you heard about that?
Absolutely. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Right?
That's exactly right. And the scientists are hoping to discover that there are other intelligent beings in the universe. And so they're looking at the electromagnetic spectrum, and they're recording it, and they're searching desperately for encoded symbols. Because if they find them, then they know for sure that there is an intelligent being or beings out there like us, because only intelligent beings encode symbols. So that's basically the idea.
So if they were to find an encoded message, then that would suggest that there is quite possibly some kind of intelligence out there, extraterrestrial intelligence, as it were. And yet the very same idea, when we find it in our DNA, for example, somehow that doesn't seem to trigger anything in many people's minds.
Well, I think it may be just a case of not thinking about it, not actually stepping back and considering it. You know, the scientific community as a whole subscribes to the theory of evolution. And that was formulated at a time where we really didn't have a lot of the technology and the things that we have. For example, when Darwin was looking at cells, he had an extremely good microscope, and he was very, very proud of it. but it couldn't even begin to resolve the things that are going on in the nucleus of a cell. So he just simply didn't have the information, and so the theories he came up with didn't account for the facts that are actually out there. We now know a lot more, and
we know that a cell is like a city. I mean, there's so much happening inside of a cell, and he just thought it was basically like a blob, like a brick, essentially. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and kind of. They knew that there were nucleus elements that were in the cell. They could see them, but they couldn't resolve down to see what was inside of them. And it really wasn't until the 50s where we got scanning electron microscopes and crystalline X-ray technology that we could actually get down to the molecular level and where these things are happening, where this information is encoded, is at the molecular level. And I don't know if a city is the right analogy for what we're talking about. Actually, what we know about computer processing and computers turns out to be a very interesting model for thinking about the cell. And there was a very bright guy, probably the brightest computer scientist that ever lived. His name was von Neumann. And he did a lot of work. He built the first computers that they were using for calculating things like trajectory of nuclear missiles and that sort of thing. And so they developed these computational machines. And what marks these machines out is they are able to process symbols. And that's something that we take for granted today because we do it all the time. We use computers. We're talking to computers now. You know, computers are able to actually take the patterns that are coming in from these sound waves and turn them back into words, which are then turned into symbols. And you may have a cell phone and it's able to take that signal and turn it into a text message. And you can read those symbols. Well, the signal is in the electromagnetic spectrum, but the fact is that there are words, and words turned into symbols reflect that there is an intelligent being that is communicating. So that's what's behind it. And von Neumann did some work when they first discovered that there were these molecular constructs in the cell that were very, very complex, and they didn't know what to make of it. And so that's really what we want to think about is, okay, what are those things? And if they're encoded information, which they are. As a matter of fact, the information that's in a DNA molecule is so sophisticated, it's so clever that the smartest people that we have that are looking at it haven't been able to figure it all out yet. And so here's something to understand. There are patterns in nature of all kinds. You run into it. There are geometric patterns. There are crystalline patterns. There are very, very complex shapes that follow the laws of physics, but they don't have information.
Okay.
And that's the important thought there. So for example, you could run into a rock and it could have really complex patterns in that rock. But if you ran into a rock and it said, Abraham Lincoln is buried here and it's got symbols carved into it, or for example, even Mount Rushmore, that's another example of information being encoded. You have beautiful rocks out there, but you don't have Abraham Lincoln, you know, that just kind of happens because over tons and tons of times it just makes that's informing an object. Yep. And only intelligent beings put information into objects. And the information is actually independent of the object itself, because you could write, you know, this is Abraham Lincoln's gravestone or whatever on a sheet of paper, or you could write that same information on a stone, or you could write it a lot of different ways, and the symbols are all the same because it's intelligence that's encoding the symbols. But the forces of nature that create objects and patterns never create anything like that. And that's why when you run into something at the heart of every human cell that has this incredible amount of information in it, you got to say, wait a minute, this didn't just happen.
Right.
So now we have to ask, from what cause did it arise? And that's why I would say that it's not that an evolution, if it's the explanation, has to account for that.
Okay.
And that's where the scientific community has not really come to terms with where technology has taken us. It hasn't really processed through this disconnect, because what we find when we look into the cell is not only is there this molecule or molecules that are extremely complex, but these molecules have absolutely no value in and of themselves.
Okay.
If you have a DNA molecule in a but it's not in a cell, it's worth exactly nothing. So the people that have tried to say somewhere on another star system in another galaxy over billions and gazillions of years, this molecule just somehow happened to come together, it doesn't do you a bit of good.
Or people like Francis Crick, who is the co-discoverer of DNA, suggested directed panspermia, right?
Well, it's because he got it. See,
Yeah.
the thing is,
Yeah.
he knew what he was looking at, and he knew that the laws of chance and the basic laws of physics do not create encoded information. And so Crick, who you referred to, the guy, one of the guys that discovered the DNA helix, he had to come up with an explanation, and his explanation was, well, it came to Earth from somewhere else.
Right.
And the problem with that is that it doesn't make it any easier, because it is impossible somewhere else.
You've got this infinite regression of some alien life force that had to account for this. In fact, I was really surprised when I read Carl Sagan's book Contact, and I thought, here you have an avid, just a passionate atheist evolutionist, and he gets his opportunity to give his version of cosmology, right, and how everything got started. And what does he do? He says, well, basically, long time ago, there were these aliens that set up all this other stuff, but they weren't the first people, because eons before them, there was this other race of ancient aliens who got even more stuff started, right? And I was really surprised. I'm like, wow, that's all you did, is that you just said, well, there were these aliens, and those weren't the first aliens, but there were these other aliens. And so all you do is you push it back infinitely, and people say, well, where did God come from? Look, somebody's got to be the first guy to get started, right? So there has to be a first cause, and you're suggesting that that first cause is the one, the being, the intelligence out there that is actually creating the intelligence, the intelligent information that we are finding in our DNA.
Well, let's be sympathetic here, because the folks that are dealing with it, the people like to ask the question, well, who created God? I mean, if everything exists has a cause, then God exists, he must have a cause. And so when we ask that question and you say, well, what caused God to exist? We're really actually, as Christians, no better off answering that question. We don't have any idea. It is a mystery. But that's important just to be honest about that. We don't know how God came to exist. But we do know that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Mm-hmm. And that's where God is different, because God never began to exist. He has simply always existed. And so he is, using theological terms, and I said I'm not a theologian, but using theological terms,
yes,
there is contingent existing, something that depends upon another thing. God's existence is not contingent. He doesn't depend on anyone else. You say, well, how do we know that he's there? Well, we know that he's there because we exist, and because we look at this thing and we see the fact that this incredible creation has occurred. Now, we can't answer the mystery any better than anyone else of how come God exists.
Right.
Maybe God at some point would want to tell us, but he's not talking about it. So, we're like everyone else. There are limits to human knowledge. And all we're saying here when we're looking at this issue of does information theory and the existence of encoded information prove the existence of God, the answer to that is it proves a being that is so sophisticated and so intelligent, so much greater than we are, that we would say this being is our creator. That's a pretty good definition of the Christian God.
Okay.
Now, I want to come back to helping everyone understand what we mean when we say it isn't just unlikely that a DNA molecule, a self-replicating DNA molecule, happened to come into existence and then start self-replicating. It's impossible.
Okay.
And that's it's a category problem, because here's the deal. The DNA molecule by itself is of no value unless it exists in a machine that is capable of executing the encoded instructions that it has in it to make these incredible complex proteins that are the basis of our life. So if you have a DNA molecule without the cell and the cellular machinery in it, it's like having a computer program with no computer to run it on.
Right.
It's worth nothing. Or conversely, if you've got a computer but no operating system and no programs, that computer is worth exactly nothing.
Right.
So for the DNA self-replicating molecule to work, you have to simultaneously and accidentally have a computer something far more complex than the most computer programs that we've ever written happen to get created by chance in some primordial soup somewhere, and at the same time it's contained in this little environment that knows exactly what to do with it and execute those instructions.
Right. I mean, to think of the enormity of software, you know, let's take your favorite operating system, whether it's Apple or PC. You know, there are millions of man hours. That means that there are thousands of people that have all been working together to make this software come together, and so that it can be, you know, it can work, right? And that's taken millions of man hours. Then to suggest that DNA, which is incredibly sophisticated, has tremendous amount of code in it, line upon line, that it somehow just happened, is preposterous. Again, it just doesn't make sense.
That's the essence of the argument that we're making, assertion. And frankly, I haven't heard any kind of reasonable rebuttal to that. You know, when you get into it and you get into discussions, you know, everybody admits we don't really know how evolution got started, and the answer is that's right. But at the core of the problem is an intractable issue. And let me just kind of circle back around and try to explain this again. So we're all familiar with running our PC programs, and people are using Macs now. They're not using PCs so much, but there used to be something called the blue screen of death on
That's
a PC.
Right. Yes.
And when you got a blue screen of death, you knew you're done.
Right.
Well, what causes a blue screen of death? What happens is you have an operating system that is running the computer, and if something goes wrong in that operating system and it doesn't know how to fix it, it goes to the blue screen of death and it basically says, I'm done, reboot.
Yes.
Okay? So here's the nature of the problem. And von Neumann, this is part of what I dealt with in my paper. Von Neumann was a brilliant guy, and he actually tried to figure out how could a self-replicating molecule come into existence where there's no one that has intelligence, no one that has principles to put into it, no one that's engineering it, and yet it has the ability to fold and replicate and make itself again and again and again, and basically do it flawlessly.
Right.
Because our DNA replicates, and it replicates with a level of precision that's incredible. Well, so here's what it's like. So even if you got, by random chance, the computer or the cell,
Right.
Even a very, very simple cell, and you got the molecule together at the same time, and you hit the go button, right? What's the chance? It's the same chance as if you had a computer, you took the instruction pointer for the program, you picked a place at random and said, start here and run successfully.
Uh-huh.
You're going to get, even if the thing actually came together, you get a blue screen of death, and the whole thing is over.
That's right.
Which means when we're talking about evolution by non-directed, non-intelligent processes selecting better and better forms, it's a fine theory, but it does nothing to explain how every single cell in our body that exists has got this book. Now, the Bible does have an explanation for this.
Okay.
It talks about in Genesis how God formed man from the dust of the earth. And it's really interesting, it picks the term dust. It's the idea of very fine particles, and you may not know that there are widely different estimates. Nobody even knows exactly how many trillions of cells are in a human body, but somewhere between 35 trillion and 70 trillion cells go into one single human being. All of these cells have got that book written in them, but every single one of them is in a slightly different place of where it's executing and how it's executing, because they're all doing slightly different things. So it's this design that God created when he created the first man, Adam, formed him from the dust, and he wrote into every single one of those cells the code of life. And now, by the way, the Bible does not say that that was a living human being, because after God did that, then it says he blew the breath of life into Adam, and he gave consciousness to Adam. And here's the other problem that the evolutionists have no explanation for, and that is, where does consciousness come from? How can chemical reactions produce I think, therefore I am. I am aware that I exist. How do you get any chemical to produce that? Nobody has any answers. So we find, again, there are plenty of mysteries in the universe, and I'm not taking a knock on our scientific friends that have invested so much in this thing, but you have to look at things and know when you don't know something. And in the case of DNA and evolution, we know this. Evolution cannot explain it. Right. They can come up with some ideas about, well, we can have combinations and things added and transcriptions, but you got to get started.
Well, let's talk about Darwin's finches for a minute. I mean, Darwin did go to the Galapagos Islands. He did note that the finches' beaks changed over time, and that was one of the keystones of his theory of evolution. So would that not be a good place to start for evolution? Well,
so I just want to be really careful here. I'm a computer scientist, and what I'm talking about, I don't pretend to be an evolutionist, and it really isn't, relative to what I'm talking about here. The fact that species are adaptive and they can change, that's well documented.
Okay.
And there's no problem with that, and that doesn't contradict anything within the Bible.
Okay.
So we shouldn't be intimidated by that.
Okay.
And there are ranges of opinion about macroevolution and how much change can occur within it. My point is that the theory that tries to explain origins and how we got here,
right,
that's what concerns me. And evolution as an explanation for our existence utterly fails to
right.
explain DNA, self-replicating DNA, the perfection of it, the intelligence of it. And we get back to the original thing that we started with is, the guys at SETI are looking for encoded information. Yeah. All they need to do is take the radio telescope, right. turn it around, point it at a human cell,
that's right.
and they will see an encoded message from God that says, I'm here,
right?
I'm here, come find me.
Yeah.
Now, the Bible says, God says, you will seek me and you will find me when you seek for me with all your heart. God exists, but he will not be found if no one looks for him. And so it's very important. He's put these things out there in the universe that say, I'm here. But it's up to us to say, I want to know if you're there, God. And if you're there, I want to know you. And I would just say to anybody watching this, if you want to know God, he's listening. Talk to him, and he will reveal himself to you. But if you don't want to know God, he's going to let you live your life the way you want to live it. For those of you who are Christians, you don't need to be intimidated by the theory of evolution, that it somehow disproves the existence of God or that any of that kind of thing, because it doesn't. Now, that doesn't make the Bible true. Lots of other reasons are there for us to look at the Bible, take it seriously, and evaluate it. But again, the purpose of this paper was all about, does information theory and the encoding of information in DNA prove the existence of God? And I think the answer to that is it does.
Yeah. My question about Darwin and his finches was that Darwin, really did go there. He saw the finches and he noted that what we would call microevolution, that there really were small, gradual changes in a species over time. We can also call that adaptation. And that is very well within the parameters of what God has created. Where he then made a leap is he took that observable phenomenon and then he deduced it all the way back to the beginning. And what we've discovered now is that because of information theory and because of just our incredible advancements in biology, we discover that the cell is incredibly complex. I've heard it likened to like a city, that it's it's not just a house, it's not just a factory, it's like a whole city because there are so many things happening in there. And at the heart of it all, there's this library called the nucleus, and inside the nucleus you have DNA. It's like your local library. It has the books, but then there has to be something that will actually take those books, read those books, copy those books, and then take those copies and then put them back into the system. And all of that was not understood or even remotely realized in the days of Darwin. And so what Pastor Don has been bringing out is this incredible information technology that we've, according to von Neumann and Turing and others who really were the pioneers of modern computers as we know them, they took this information, as you put it, the forming of code, encoded messages,
symbols,
as symbols, right? And that's why we're looking for life out there in the universe with the SETI program, saying, man, we sure would like to find something out there. And yet, what are we looking for? We're looking for intelligent code, encoded symbols that would give us a clue that maybe there's somebody out there. And yet, at least the majority has said, well, there is no God, and so it's all based on evolution. And yet we find that evolution, as taught by microevolution, Darwinian evolution, is basically bankrupt, and information theory or information understanding has really helped us to understand that there has to be somebody who created that information, because information, according to Dr. Werner Gitt, he wrote a book called In the Beginning Was Information, and he talked about information is a non-material entity and it doesn't happen by itself. Somebody has to write that. Some years ago I went to a college campus and I took my cell phone. I said, do you think this evolved? And they're like, oh no, that's impossible. There's all this programs and the hardware. And I said, what about the human body or DNA? They're like, oh, well, that's different. And yet really it isn't. When you get inside of DNA, you start to look at this, so many lines of code, and then you even have things like where they, what's the word I'm looking for? They squeeze it together, they compress it, all right? They compress the code, or I shouldn't say they, but God compressed the code in DNA by actually wrapping it.
Oh yeah. And there's so much there. I want to go back to one thing on Darwin here,
yes,
because this will be helpful. Darwin's theory was that there was gradual increase in complexity from simpler life forms to more complex life form. And in his treatise, he makes it very clear that the fossil record is going to bear witness, once we have investigated it, of these transitionary forms from one complex life form into a more complex life form. Mm-hmm. And so here's just something to think about. We now know that the form that any creature has comes from the information that's in the DNA. So whether it's a shellfish or whether it's a mastodon shark, a mastodon mammal, or a human being, or a tree, whatever form that thing physically takes is a reflection of the information that has been encoded and then executed from the DNA. So here's what and Darwin said, if you don't find the transitory forms in the fossil records, then this is a provably false theory. And that's important. Any theory that cannot be falsified is worthless. And so Darwin said it is falsifiable. Well, in fact, the fossil record has falsified the theory, because what we find even in the very, very simplest, you know, Precambrian fossils, is that they're incredibly complex and they're fully formed.
They call it the Cambrian explosion, right?
And there's this Cambrian explosion.
Right.
And when you find forms, you find many forms that don't exist today, but they're not simple. And the reality is that any kind of compromise of the DNA information of the sort that would allow you to get a new kind of creature is fatal. Okay? So when you break the program, that's the end.
That's the blue screen of death.
That's the blue screen of death. And
Right.
so the theory, you know, it's like many other scientific theories. You know, we look back on them and we go, how could anybody actually believe in something called spontaneous generation? You know, it wasn't until Pascal came along and,
That's
you know,
true.
and actually, you know, boiled the thing and showed, yeah, you know, it's not spontaneous. There are living things in there.
Yeah.
You know,
Hence pasteurization, right?
right,
Because,
pasteurization.
Right.
So, unfortunately, during a particular season of time in human history, a scientific idea will have great credibility, and anybody who questions it, you know, is treated as a kook.
Right.
But the reality is that over time, new information comes in that forces us to go back and reevaluate and say, you know what, it isn't what we thought, because there is this new information. And that's what I would say about this issue on the information theory. The explosion of computing technology, the ability to get down to the molecular level and discover the mysteries that are actually going on there that we had no idea about, tell us that whatever the answers are about the origin of life in the universe, it certainly is not evolution. And that should make us say, well, all right, if that's not the answer, what is? And that's what God is waiting for. He's saying, yeah, I'm out here, I'm waiting, come find me.
Now, this is a little bit off topic, but I'm really curious your thoughts on this, because you have obviously done a lot of research and formal study in computer science, information technology, but there is a school of thought that artificial intelligence is going to be something that we need to reckon with. In fact, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are recently having a little tiff about whether it's dangerous or not. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook is saying, it's no big deal. He's very optimistic that AI is going to be all rosy. Elon Musk, on the other hand, is saying, no, this is really a problem. We need to start taking measures right now. I think the basic idea is that at one day, AI, I'm not sure that Elon Musk is saying this, but one day AI and artificial intelligence could become so sophisticated they could sort of, you know, almost become conscious, or some people might say become conscious, sort of Terminator-like. But my question then is, do you think, one, that's in any way possible? Two, do you think that's just based on this evolutionary idea that, hey, we evolved this far, and if we can do it, maybe the machines can do it too?
I think we're mixing apples and oranges.
Okay.
When we talk about these issues. It's a really fun thing. So let me just share a few thoughts with you on that. And I wouldn't want to puff up my credentials. As a matter of fact, I personally am just in awe of the way the technology is expanding. And there are so many things that are happening now that are very, very impressive. The ability to have self-driving cars that do exhibit intelligence, and but we need to be clear that there is a difference between intelligence and being alive. They're not exactly the same thing, because what's going on, it's like a book. Is a book alive? You can read a book that was written a couple of thousand years ago, and as you read those symbols that are encoded on that page, you are taken back into direct contact with the mind of the person that wrote it.
Okay.
Now, the book itself is not alive, but it's got something inside it that is kind of alive. There are lots of mysteries here, and we don't want to be foolish, okay? Now, let's just talk about the test that was come up with, and I think it was Turing that came up with it. And his statement was, if you have a person behind a curtain, and you have a computer behind the curtain, and you ask it questions, and you can't tell which one is the person and which one is the machine, then you have to admit that the computer is conscious, because it's doing just as well as the human being.
Okay.
And that's a pretty interesting and stunning test. And so there's something really interesting in the Bible. It talks about an idol that is going to be set up in the temple in Jerusalem
During the beast.
The image of the beast.
Yes.
It's called the abomination of desolation, and people are forced, according to the prophecy of the Bible, to bow down and worship this thing. And the Bible says that that it's given life.
Breath, in fact. Yes.
And so I wouldn't want to make any kind of, when God created us, he breathed into us life and the ability to pass life on, to procreate. There are tremendous mysteries here. I would be very careful.
Okay.
Now, having said that, let me tell a very quick cautionary tale. When I was going through computer science, and I hate to date myself, we had this theoretical concept about computers that somebody might create something that was not like a regular program that you want, but was actually a malicious piece of code that could jump between computers and hurt them, and we called them viruses. Now, it was purely a theoretical idea at the time. And for those of us that were studying computer science, we love computer science because it's mathematical, and mathematics is pure. And there is no defects within the axioms. And the idea that somehow this mathematical pure world could be contaminated by something like a virus just seemed totally bizarre and far-fetched.
Right.
Well, we all know you better have virus protection on your computer now.
That's right.
Because the whole cyberspace has become infected. And the curse that God cursed us with when we rebelled against him is inherent in man. And so it's therefore inherent in everything that man creates.
But these viruses are created by humans.
That's exactly right.
Randomly
But here's where I'm going with this, because you were asking me about AI.
Right.
Okay. The problem is, because we're sinful and we're creating these incredibly complex and sophisticated robots with artificial intelligence, and they're infected with evil because human beings are infected with evil.
Right.
And we don't know how, just like we don't know how to put the atomic bomb, that genie, back in the bottle.
Yeah.
We have no idea. And what we see is we're approaching the end of the world, and we are approaching with all of these different things that are converging.
Right.
Is that things are getting increasingly out of the ability of humanity to control. And we're going to need someone to come and rescue us. Fortunately, his name is Jesus, and he's coming.
Yes. We're basically opening Pandora's box.
Well, we've opened it.
Yes.
And that leavening process of evil, despite the best intentions of human beings, and not the best intentions of human beings, has infected this world. And so it is extraordinarily dangerous. And the same thing, by the way, can be said of what we're doing with DNA. We've got extremely brilliant people trying to figure out how to get in there and manipulate the code,
right,
to create new creatures with new capabilities, which would be fine if we were good. But the problem is we're flawed. And so there's no one that can guarantee that unlocking this thing and changing the core self-replicating life as designed by God for purposes that God never intended,
right,
is going to take us into not a good place.
Well, in my opinion, this sounds like a repeat of what happened before the flood of Noah. Is that you had the sons of God came down, and they took the daughters of men, and they created a hybrid race. If we look at some of the extra biblical texts, such as the Book of Enoch, for example, and some other things that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it has this story of this mixing of human DNA with other DNA, and something that
well,
God
of course, it doesn't actually talk about DNA, so let's be careful.
It talks about seed.
Yeah, it talks about seed, and
yes,
and we want to be careful with this, because there was a reason, I do believe in the flood, that there was a worldwide flood, and that God wiped everything out. And there's a reason why he wiped everything out.
Yes.
Because it had become totally toxic. So as we investigate this stuff, we need to be very careful and circumspect. There's a reason why God didn't want that.
Sure.
And so, but to your point, we are escalating now with these, and it's not in one area. We're escalating in multiple areas. But we've totally gotten off the track of information theory.
That's all part of the fun. Well, I see it, you know, that information theory, while it does substantiate the need for a creator, you know, as we're going in these different directions of information theory. I mean, humanity, just to some degree, like it or not, is becoming a creator of other kinds of things.
Yeah.
And as you're suggesting, you know, we're letting that genie out of the box, Pandora's box, if you will. And can we put it back in once we open it? Probably not.
And the,
right?
the problem is, you know, people are wondering, they're speculating, is there intelligent life in the universe besides humanity? Right. The Bible's on record on this one, and it's been on for a long time. There certainly is. And they're extremely powerful, and they're not all good. As a matter of fact, some are unspeakably evil. So there's a lot going on here, and it's not like humanity is acting on its own in terms of exploring these things. We're getting help.
Right.
And when you, by the way, when you look at some of the jumps that we make in technology, it's very, very curious where the insights come from. And so, yeah. So bringing up what happened before the flood, I think is pretty interesting, but we want to be very careful as we look at those things, because there's a lot of misinformation out there as well.
Fair enough. All right. Well, if you were just to summarize for our listeners, you know, just a really quick summary of how information technology proves, or at least, you know, strongly suggests that there's a creator, you know, something that they could kind of use if they're evangelizing, or kind of the elevator pitch, if you will. You know, what would you give them, just a little takeaway?
So, you know, just real simple. Information is the forming of symbols within the material world. It is not done by physical processes, and it certainly doesn't happen by chance. You don't get Shakespeare's play by chance, you know. And that's not a new argument. That's been around for a long time.
Sure. What's
new is what we've discovered at the molecular level within the cells, that there is this book that's been written by God, and it's not just a book. It's not like something that you read. It's a living, active thing that's much like a computer that has the ability to execute and replicate, and there are multiple parts to it, and it all exhibits an incredible design. That has to be explained.
Yeah.
And the attempt to explain it scientifically purely by random chance and selection of the fittest, it doesn't work. And it's not that it's unlikely or exceedingly improbable. It's impossible.
Right.
And so what you can do is appeal to people and say, look, every single cell in your body has got this incredible book written. Who wrote the book? And he would like you to search for him, because he loves you. That's the way I put it.
Well put. Well, thank you, Pastor Don, for joining us and for really giving us just so much to chew on when it comes to this really this book of life, if you will. This book that contains information that is responsible for our life. Who wrote the book? That is the big question. And if you could answer that question and get to know the author of that book, then you'll discover that so many, I'd say pretty much every other question in life, that at least the big ones, will be answered when you get in touch with the author of the book that is inside each of our cells. I want to thank you guys for joining us for the Awakening Report. As always, stay in the Word, because the Bible has the answers. It's so awesome. Until next time, God bless.